October 25, 1944, 10:53 in the morning, off the coast of Samar Island, Philippines. Ensign Bill Brooks stood at his anti-aircraft gun station aboard the escort carrier USS St, tracking what appeared to be a damaged Japanese Zero fighter, trailing smoke as it descended from 3,000 feet. The aircraft was behaving strangely, not attempting to pull up or bail out, but maintaining a steady controlled descent directly toward his ship. Brooks followed standard procedure, his gun crew pouring 40mm shells into the approaching aircraft, seeing hits register along the fuselage and wings. The Zero absorbed the punishment and continued its approach with mechanical precision. In the final seconds before impact, Brooks saw the pilot's face through the canopy, not contorted in panic or desperation, but calm and focused with deliberate intent. Then comprehension struck with the force of physical impact. This pilot wasn't trying to crash, he was aiming. The Zero struck the St. Lo's flight deck at 10:53, penetrating through to the hangar deck below where its bomb and remaining fuel detonated, among armed and fueled aircraft. Within minutes, secondary explosions tore through the escort carrier. At 11:25, barely 30 minutes after the initial impact, the USS St. became the first major American warship ever sunk by a deliberate suicide attack. Of the ship's complement of 889 officers and men, 113 were killed instantly or went down with the ship. Another 30 would die from their wounds in the following days. The age of kamikaze warfare had begun, and American sailors were about to confront a form of warfare that contradicted every assumption they held about human behavior in combat. The concept that would become known as kamikaze, meaning divine wind in reference to the typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, emerged from Japan's increasingly desperate strategic situation in October 1944. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines on October 17th to assume command of the 1st Air Fleet with the task of defending the islands against the approaching American invasion force. His assessment of available resources was devastating. The Japanese Navy had approximately 100 operational aircraft in the Philippines, facing an American force that included over 1,000 carrier-based planes and hundreds more land-based aircraft. Conventional attacks had proven catastrophically inefficient. Analysis showed that fewer than 1 in 10 Japanese aircraft that attacked American task forces managed to score hits, and most of those hits failed to sink or severely damage their targets. The mathematics were inescapable. Japan was losing aircraft and irreplaceable trained pilots at rates that guaranteed defeat within months. Onishi's solution was radical and terrifying in its cold logic. If conventional bombing resulted in perhaps a 10% hit rate, what if the aircraft itself became the weapon? A pilot guiding his plane directly into a target would achieve nearly 100% accuracy. The loss rate would be identical, 1 pilot and 1 aircraft per mission, but the effectiveness would increase tenfold or more. On October 19th, Onishi addressed the pilots of the 201st Air Group at Mabalacat Airfield. He explained that Japan's situation demanded extraordinary measures, that conventional tactics could not stop the American advance, and that the only way to achieve decisive results was through deliberate suicide attacks targeting American aircraft carriers. He asked for volunteers. According to witnesses, every pilot in the room stepped forward immediately. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a 23-year-old Navy pilot and 1941 graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima, was selected to lead the first organized kamikaze unit. Seki had married just months earlier and reportedly told fellow officers that he did not expect to return from the mission but would do his duty. The unit was designated the Shimpu Special Attack Corps, with Shimpu being an alternate reading of the characters for kamikaze. 4 subunits were formed and named after symbols of Japanese culture: Shikishima, Yamato, Asahi, and Yamazakura, each representing aspects of the Japanese spirit and warrior tradition. The American forces approaching the Philippines in October 1944 were the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. The 3rd Fleet under Admiral William Halsey included 8 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, 6 battleships, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. The 7th Fleet supporting the amphibious landings at Leyte included another 18 escort carriers providing close air support. American sailors had been fighting the Japanese for nearly 3 years, since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. They had witnessed Japanese bravery and fanaticism in countless battles. They had seen enemy soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. They had watched crippled Japanese aircraft attempt to crash into American ships as a last desperate act when all other options were exhausted. But these acts were understood within the framework of conventional warfare. A pilot whose plane was doomed might try to take an enemy ship with him, rather than die for nothing. What was about to unfold was entirely different. A systematic, organised campaign where suicide wasn't the last resort but the primary tactic. Where death wasn't the consequence of combat but the method of combat itself. October 21st brought the first hints of what was coming. During air operations supporting the Leyte landings, several Japanese aircraft exhibited unusual behaviour, making no attempt to release weapons or evade defensive fire, but diving directly toward American ships. The destroyer USS Claxton reported an aircraft that pressed its attack despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, eventually crashing into the sea just yards from the ship. The cruiser HMS Australia was struck by a Japanese aircraft that made no attempt to release its bomb before impact, killing 30 Australian sailors. These incidents were noted but not immediately understood as representing a new tactic. American intelligence officers classified them as desperate actions by damaged aircraft or fanatical individual pilots, not evidence of an organised campaign. October 25, 1944 would be remembered by the survivors as the day everything changed. The Battle off Samar, a component of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, saw Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful surface force of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers encounter a small American force known as Taffy 3, consisting of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The Americans found themselves in desperate circumstances, their thin-skinned escort carriers facing battleship guns at point-blank range. While the heroic actions of American destroyers and destroyer escorts helped save most of Taffy 3, and Kurita inexplicably withdrew after achieving tactical surprise, the escort carriers faced an additional threat that morning that would prove more psychologically devastating than Kurita's battleship guns. At 10:47, lookouts aboard multiple ships of Taffy 3 reported incoming Japanese aircraft, approximately 6 Zero fighters approaching from the northeast at 3,000 feet altitude. Standard defensive procedures commenced. Combat air patrols were vectored to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns tracked and opened fire. The Japanese aircraft spread out, each apparently selecting an individual target among the escort carriers. This too seemed standard, a conventional attack run. Then the pilots did something that defied all experience and training. They didn't level off to drop torpedoes. They didn't climb to bombing altitude. They didn't strafe and then break away. Instead, each aircraft entered a controlled dive directly toward its selected target, maintaining course despite defensive fire that raked their aircraft with hits. Aboard the USS Fanshawe Bay, Seaman First Class James Fornataro watched a Zero diving directly toward his ship's bridge. He described the moment years later in an interview recorded by the Naval Institute. The plane was smoking, we were hitting it. Pieces were coming off, but it kept coming straight at us. It wasn't wobbling or spinning like a damaged plane falls. It was aimed. For the first time, I realized the pilot didn't want to pull up. He wasn't trying to drop a bomb or shoot at us. He was turning himself and his plane into a bomb. That realization, I can't describe the feeling. It was like suddenly understanding that the rules had changed, but nobody told you what the new rules were. The Zero struck Fanshawe Bay's flight deck aft of the island superstructure, its bomb penetrating before detonation. The explosion killed 3 men and wounded 20, but the ship's damage control parties contained the fires and flooding. Fanshawe Bay survived. The escort carrier USS White Plains was targeted by another Zero that pressed its attack through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Chief Gunner's mate Harold Swanson recalled that the aircraft's engine was clearly damaged, trailing smoke and losing power, but the pilot maintained control and guided his dying aircraft directly toward the carrier's deck. At the last moment, defensive fire severed the Zero's tail section and it tumbled into the sea just yards from the ship, close enough that fragments from the explosion peppered the hull. Seaman Robert Hagan, who witnessed the near miss, said the most disturbing aspect wasn't the near destruction of his ship, but the realization that came with it. We'd been fighting the Japanese for years. We knew they were tough, that they didn't quit easy. But this was different. This wasn't fighting to the death. This was using death as a weapon. When you shoot at a bomber, you're trying to kill the pilot and destroy the plane so it can't drop its bomb on you. But if killing the pilot and destroying the plane doesn't stop the attack because the pilot and the plane are the bomb, what are you supposed to do? The USS Kalinin Bay was struck by a Zero that penetrated the flight deck and detonated inside the ship. The explosion killed 5 men and wounded 50, started multiple fires and damaged the ship's steering. While the crew fought to save their vessel, another Zero targeted the already damaged carrier, crashing into the port side and causing additional casualties and fires. That a second aircraft would deliberately target an already burning ship suggested a level of coordination that indicated this wasn't random individual fanaticism, but an organized tactical system. The USS Kitkan Bay experienced what many sailors would later describe as the most horrifying near miss of the battle. A Zero fighter emerged from clouds barely 1,000 yards away, already in its dive with no time for fighters to intercept. Every gun that could bear opened fire, tracers converging on the diving aircraft. Sailors watched as hits registered along the fuselage and wings, saw chunks of metal torn away, saw the canopy shatter. The plane continued its dive with no deviation. At 300 yards, the Zero's engine appeared to lose power, the nose dropped slightly, and the aircraft plunged into the ocean approximately 30 feet from the ship's port side. The water column from the impact drenched the flight deck. Fragments of aircraft wreckage and what witnesses identified as human remains landed on deck. According to the ship's action report, several sailors required medical treatment for psychological shock from the near miss, an unprecedented entry in action reports from a battle where men routinely faced death. Then came the USS St. At 10:53, Lieutenant Yukio Seki's Zero dove through defensive fire and struck the escort carrier's flight deck. The aircraft and its 250-kilogram bomb penetrated through the flight deck into the hangar deck, where armed and fueled aircraft were staged for launch. The initial explosion ignited aviation gasoline and armed weapons in the hangar bay. Secondary explosions began almost immediately as bombs and torpedo warheads detonated in the growing conflagration. Damage control parties responding to fight the fires were caught in subsequent explosions. The ship's engineering spaces flooded as hull plates buckled from internal blasts. At 10:57, barely 4 minutes after the initial impact, a massive explosion, possibly a torpedo magazine detonating, tore through the St. Lou's hull. The escort carrier began listing heavily to port. At 11 o'clock, Captain Francis McKenna gave the order to abandon ship. Men leapt from the tilting deck into water covered with burning oil. Those below deck struggled through smoke-filled passageways as the ship's list increased. At 11:25, 32 minutes after being struck, the USS St. Louis capsized and sank, the first major American warship sunk by a deliberate suicide attack. Survivors in the water watched their ship disappear beneath the waves and struggled to process what had happened. Ensign Reginald Ziegler, who survived the sinking, later wrote in his diary that the most disturbing aspect of the attack wasn't the violence of the explosion or the terror of abandoning ship, but the implication of what it meant. The Japanese pilot who killed us had decided to kill us before he ever took off. He got in his plane knowing he was already dead, just flying to the place where his death would mean something. How do you fight someone who's already made peace with dying? Our guns killed him, but he killed us anyway because killing him didn't stop him. The rules of warfare said if you can shoot down the enemy bomber before it drops its bomb, you win. But if the bomber is the bomb, shooting it down just means it crashes into you instead of flying into you. The attacks that morning of October 25th resulted in the sinking of the St. Louis and severe damage to 4 other escort carriers, with hundreds of American sailors killed or wounded. But the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Word of the suicide attack spread through the American fleet with shocking speed. Sailors who hadn't witnessed the attacks heard descriptions from survivors and crews of the targeted ships. The accounts all emphasized the same terrifying elements. The pilots showed no hesitation. They made no attempt to break off their attacks. They aimed their aircraft with precision despite defensive fire. They continued their attacks even as their aircraft disintegrated around them. They succeeded by dying. Every assumption about aerial combat, about human behavior, about the relationship between attack and defense, had been fundamentally challenged. The American military had extensive experience with the Japanese willingness to fight to the death. Marine Corps veterans of Pacific Island campaigns had witnessed banzai charges where Japanese soldiers attacked fortified positions with no hope of success, seeking death in combat rather than surrender. Army forces had encountered similar fanaticism in New Guinea and the Philippines. These actions were understood, if not fully comprehended, within existing military frameworks. Soldiers in desperate circumstances sometimes chose death over capture. Defeated forces sometimes made suicide attacks as final acts of defiance. But these were actions taken by men facing defeat, last stands by cornered forces with no alternatives remaining. The kamikaze attacks were categorically different. These were trained pilots assigned to suicide missions before any conventional options had been exhausted. They took off from secure air bases with the explicit intention of dying. Their deaths weren't the possible consequence of dangerous missions, but the absolute prerequisite for mission success. The American naval doctrine for defending against air attacks was based on layers of defense. Combat air patrols intercepted attackers at distance. Long-range anti-aircraft fire engaged survivors at several thousand yards. Medium-range guns engaged at closer distances. Close-in weapons provided last-ditch defense. This layered approach assumed that inflicting damage on attacking aircraft would cause them to break off attacks, release weapons early, or lose accuracy. Each defensive layer that damaged an aircraft reduced the threat it posed. This doctrine became partially irrelevant against kamikaze attacks. Damage that would cause a conventional attacker to abort its run, release weapons prematurely, or lose accuracy had no equivalent effect on a suicide attacker. A kamikaze pilot with his aircraft on fire, his engine failing, and wounds that would be fatal in minutes still posed a full threat if he could maintain enough control to reach his target. The defensive requirement changed from damaging the attacking aircraft to completely destroying it before impact, a much more difficult standard to achieve. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Lafferty, who commanded anti-aircraft batteries aboard the battleship USS Pennsylvania during later operations against kamikaze attacks, described the psychological challenge for gun crews. When you're firing at a conventional bomber, every hit is progress. You see smoke trailing, see the plane waver, and you know you're stopping the attack. The plane will probably drop its bombs short and turn away if it can. You're winning. But against these suicide planes, none of that mattered. You could tear the plane apart, the wings could be shredded, the engine could be smoking and failing, and it made no difference. The plane kept coming at the same trajectory, because the pilot only needed it to hold together for a few more seconds. You're hitting it, you're destroying it, but you're not stopping it. You haven't won until it impacts the water instead of your ship. That means you have to kill it completely, not just hurt it badly. And even when you do kill the pilot, even when he's certainly dead at the controls, the aircraft keeps coming on momentum toward your ship. You end up shooting at a dead man guiding a falling bomb. The psychological toll on our gun crews was severe. They were doing everything right, achieving hits that should have stopped attacks, but watching the attacks succeed anyway. The kamikaze attacks of October 25th were immediately reported up the chain of command. Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding 7th Fleet, notified Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor. Nimitz in turn informed Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington. The initial reports emphasized the tactical results, ships damaged and sunk, casualties inflicted. But subsequent reports from commanders at the scene began addressing the psychological and strategic implications. Admiral Clifton Sprague's after-action report from the Samar engagement noted that the suicide attacks represented a new form of warfare requiring immediate tactical and doctrinal responses. Admiral Thomas Sprague, commanding all 3 Taffy escort carrier groups, noted that the effectiveness of the suicide attacks exceeded anything Japanese conventional air attacks had achieved in the Philippines campaign. Intelligence analysis of the October 25th attacks began immediately. Interrogation of captured Japanese naval personnel in the following weeks confirmed that the attacks had been organized as a deliberate tactic, not spontaneous acts by individual pilots. The special attack units had been formed specifically for suicide missions. Pilots had been selected and briefed on the tactic. Aircraft had been modified in some cases with additional armor around the cockpit to help pilots survive defensive fire long enough to complete their dives. The bombs carried were fused to detonate on impact rather than being released conventionally. Every aspect of the attacks had been planned and systematized. This was not fanaticism in the heat of battle, but cold calculation in headquarters planning sessions. American commanders grappled with the strategic implications of an enemy willing to expend pilots and aircraft on one-way missions. Captain Arleigh Burke, then serving on Admiral Mark Mitch's staff aboard the carrier USS Lexington, wrote in his private papers that the suicide tactic fundamentally changed the casualty exchange ratio. Traditional air combat involved a calculation: how many enemy aircraft could be shot down versus how many American aircraft would be lost. This ratio favored the United States, which was producing aircraft and training pilots at rates Japan couldn't match. The American strategy was one of attrition, accepting that battles would cost American lives but inflicting unsustainable losses on Japanese forces. But suicide attacks eliminated this calculation. A kamikaze pilot who successfully crashed into an American carrier had achieved an exchange ratio vastly favorable to Japan. One obsolete aircraft and one pilot, potentially a novice with minimal training, had destroyed or severely damaged a carrier representing hundreds of thousands of tons of industrial production, months of construction time, and a crew of nearly 1,000 trained sailors. Even if 9 out of 10 kamikaze attacks failed, the 10th that succeeded might sink a carrier. This was a trade-off Japan could sustain much longer than conventional attrition warfare. The psychological impact on American sailors extended beyond those who directly experienced the October 25th attacks. Word spread throughout the Pacific Fleet within days. Sailors on ships that had never encountered kamikaze attacks heard detailed accounts from survivors and witnesses. The descriptions emphasized elements that seemed designed to maximize psychological effect: pilots deliberately aiming their aircraft at ships, aircraft continuing to attack despite being hit repeatedly, planes diving with mechanical precision towards specific aim points. The message was clear and terrifying. The Japanese had found a way to use human beings as precision-guided weapons, and there was no complete defense against an attacker willing to die to achieve his mission. The Battle of Leyte Gulf concluded on October 26th with a decisive American strategic victory. The Japanese combined fleet had been shattered, losing 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. American naval dominance in the Pacific was assured, but the kamikaze attacks of October 25th introduced a new threat that would haunt American naval operations for the remaining 10 months of the war. Between October 25th, 1944, and the end of the war in August 1945, approximately 2,800 Japanese pilots would die in kamikaze attacks. These attacks would sink 34 American ships, damage 368 others, kill nearly 5,000 American sailors, and wound another 4,800. The psychological impact would prove even more extensive, affecting morale, tactics, and strategic planning throughout the remaining Pacific campaign. November and December 1944 saw the kamikaze tactic expand as Japanese commanders recognized its effectiveness. The Philippines campaign continued with American forces conducting amphibious landings on multiple islands. Each landing required naval support from carriers, battleships, and cruisers that remained offshore for days or weeks, providing air cover and gunfire support. These ships became targets for waves of kamikaze attacks. The strikes came at all hours, in all weather conditions, with attackers emerging from clouds, skimming wave tops below radar coverage, or hiding in the glare of the setting sun before diving on American ships. Sailors developed their own psychological coping mechanisms for facing the kamikaze threat. Some became fatalistic, believing that survival was entirely random and that worrying about attacks was pointless, since defensive fire might or might not stop an attacker. Others developed elaborate superstitions about what actions or behaviors provided protection. Still others requested transfers to shore duty or non-combat assignments, requests that were generally denied given the critical shortage of experienced personnel. Medical officers noted increasing rates of what was termed operational fatigue or combat exhaustion, conditions we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Sailors experienced nightmares about being crashed into by aircraft. They startled at unexpected sounds. They had difficulty sleeping even when off-duty. Some developed physical symptoms including tremors, digestive problems, and heart palpitations when their ships were called to general quarters for air defense. The destroyer USS Laffey would earn the nickname the ship that would not die after surviving repeated kamikaze attacks off Okinawa in April 1945. But even before that engagement, the ship's crew experienced the psychological strain of facing suicide attacks. Seaman Robert Johnson, who served aboard Laffey during the Philippines campaign, wrote in a letter to his parents that the constant threat of kamikaze attacks was more stressful than conventional air raids had been. During a regular air raid, you knew the enemy planes were trying to drop bombs or torpedoes and get away safely. They didn't want to die any more than you did. That gave you something to work with. If you damaged their planes enough, they'd turn back. If you made the target too dangerous, they'd look for an easier target. But these suicide planes don't care how much you hit them. They're already planning to die, so hurting them doesn't change their behavior. The only thing that stops them is complete destruction, and sometimes they hit you anyway because you destroyed them so close to your ship that the wreckage still crashes into you. You can do everything right and still die. That's what makes it so hard to deal with. The kamikaze threat changed American tactical operations in fundamental ways. Aircraft carriers, previously considered mobile fortified bases that could operate within 100 miles of enemy-held territory, were withdrawn to safer distances whenever possible. The risk that a single successful kamikaze attack could cripple or sink a fleet carrier carrying 100 aircraft became unacceptable. Carriers began operating further from combat zones, reducing their effectiveness but improving their survivability. Destroyers and smaller ships were positioned as radar pickets around larger vessels, providing early warning of incoming attacks and serving as sacrificial shields, absorbing kamikaze attacks that might otherwise reach high-value targets. These radar picket destroyers suffered disproportionate casualties throughout the later Pacific War, with sailors aboard these vessels knowing they were deliberately being placed in the most dangerous positions. Anti-aircraft armament increased dramatically across the fleet. Ships returned to port for modifications that added more 40mm and 20mm guns, often by removing torpedo tubes, depth charge racks, or other weapon systems to make room. The theory was that more guns meant more chances to shoot down incoming kamikazes before impact. Fire control radar systems were modified to track low-flying aircraft more effectively. Gun crews drilled constantly, practicing engagement of targets diving at steep angles rather than the level or shallow dive attacks they had trained against earlier in the war. The doctrine evolved to emphasize volume of fire over precision. Gun crews were instructed to put as many shells as possible in the path of incoming suicide aircraft, creating a wall of shrapnel that might disintegrate the aircraft before impact. Despite these defensive improvements, kamikaze attacks continued to achieve a disturbingly high success rate. Intelligence analysis suggested that approximately 20% of kamikaze attacks that reached their targets resulted in hits, a rate 4 to 5 times higher than conventional bombing or torpedo attacks achieved. This high success rate stemmed from fundamental advantages inherent to suicide attacks. A kamikaze pilot could observe his target's defensive fire and adjust his approach accordingly, maneuvering to avoid concentrated fire, approaching from directions that limited the number of guns that could engage him, timing his final dive to minimize exposure to defensive fire. He didn't need to worry about having enough fuel or control authority to return to base, allowing more aggressive maneuvers that conventional pilots would avoid. His aircraft didn't need to be in good condition, just barely flyable enough to reach the target area and make one controlled descent. Damaged aircraft, obsolete models, and planes flown by minimally trained pilots could all serve as kamikaze platforms when they would be useless for conventional combat. The Japanese further refined the kamikaze tactic based on experience. Initial attacks in October 1944 had used standard fighter aircraft, primarily Zeros, carrying their normal armament plus perhaps an additional bomb. By early 1945, the Japanese were producing aircraft designed specifically for suicide missions. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, called Baka by American forces meaning fool, was essentially a manned cruise missile. The aircraft consisted of a 2 600-pound warhead mounted on a small fuselage with stubby wings and 3 solid-fuel rockets. A bomber would carry the Oka to within 20 miles of American ships, release it, and the Oka pilot would glide toward the target before igniting his rockets for a terminal dive at over 600 miles per hour. The Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi was designed as a cheap mass-produced kamikaze aircraft with non-retractable landing gear that would be jettisoned after takeoff since this plane would never land. These purpose-built suicide weapons represented the industrialization and systematization of the kamikaze tactic, moving from expedient use of conventional aircraft to dedicated platforms optimized for one-way missions. The Okinawa campaign, beginning in April 1945, saw kamikaze attacks reach their peak intensity. The island's proximity to Japanese home islands allowed continuous mass attacks on American naval forces supporting the invasion. Between April 1st and June 22, 1945, Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties against American ships around Okinawa. These attacks sank 26 American ships and damaged 164 others. Among the sunk were several destroyers, destroyer escorts, and smaller vessels serving as radar pickets or close-in fire support. The damaged included numerous carriers, battleships, and cruisers that suffered fires, flooding, and casualties from kamikaze impacts. The casualties among American naval personnel at Okinawa exceeded 9,000 killed and wounded, with the majority resulting from kamikaze attacks rather than conventional air raids or surface combat. The sustained intensity of kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign created unprecedented psychological strain on American sailors. Ships remained at general quarters for hours or days at a time during periods of mass attacks. Gun crews fired thousands of rounds at attacking aircraft until barrels overheated and ammunition ran low. Damage control parties fought fires and flooding from near misses and hits, while new attacks continued. Medical personnel treated wounded sailors while stationed at battle dressing stations that themselves became targets when kamikazes crashed into ships. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the knowledge that attacks could come at any moment from any direction, and the understanding that there was no complete defense against an attacker willing to die created what military psychiatrists recognized as a mental health crisis. The destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley shot down 23 Japanese aircraft on May 11, 1945, while serving as a radar picket off Okinawa, but was then struck by multiple kamikaze attacks that killed 29 crew members and wounded 67 others. Survivors described the experience of facing wave after wave of suicide attacks with no respite. Seaman Kenneth Wright recalled that after the third kamikaze struck the ship, he realized that the Japanese had unlimited attackers willing to die while his ship had limited defensive ammunition and a crew approaching exhaustion. He said the psychological breaking point came when he understood that the attacks would continue until either his ships sank or ran out of ammunition, whichever came first. The mathematics was simple and terrible. The Japanese could lose 100 planes and pilots without strategic consequence. His ship couldn't survive even 5 kamikaze hits. It wasn't a fair fight. Not because of weapons or training or courage, but because one side was playing by rules that valued survival, and the other side had abandoned those rules entirely. American naval commanders recognized that the kamikaze threat was unsustainable. Loss rates during the Okinawa campaign suggested that if the pattern continued during an invasion of the Japanese home islands, casualties would be catastrophic. Intelligence estimates projected that the Japanese had thousands of aircraft reserved for kamikaze attacks against an invasion fleet. American planners calculated that defending against sustained mass kamikaze attacks during several months of operations around Japan would likely result in the loss of dozens of major warships and possibly hundreds of smaller vessels, with casualties potentially exceeding 20,000 killed and wounded sailors. These projections contributed significantly to the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in August 1945. The prospect of facing unlimited kamikaze attacks during an invasion of the home islands influenced strategic choices at the highest levels of American government and military leadership. The immediate end of the war, following the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender in August 1945, brought relief to American sailors who'd faced the kamikaze threat. But the psychological impact of those attacks persisted for decades. Veterans of ships that had survived kamikaze strikes or witnessed the attacks described recurring nightmares about aircraft crashing into ships. Many experienced anxiety around aircraft, even in peacetime civilian settings. The trauma of facing an enemy who used death as a weapon, who couldn't be deterred by the threat of death because death was his objective, created psychological wounds that proved resistant to healing. Post-war analysis of the Kamikaze campaign revealed its disturbing effectiveness. Japanese forces had expended approximately 2,800 pilots and aircraft in organized suicide attacks between October 1944 and August 1945. These attacks sank 34 American ships, damaged 368 others, and killed or wounded nearly 10,000 American sailors. The loss exchange ratio was far more favorable to Japan than conventional air combat had achieved. A single successful kamikaze attack might kill more Americans and cause more damage than a dozen conventional bombing or torpedo attacks. The tactic's psychological impact amplified its material effectiveness, disrupting American operations, forcing tactical and strategic adjustments, and creating sustained stress among crews who faced the threat. The kamikaze phenomenon raised profound questions about warfare, culture, and human psychology that continue to resonate. How did Japanese military culture create conditions where thousands of young men volunteered for suicide missions? What were the selection criteria and training methods used to prepare kamikaze pilots? How did the pilots themselves understand and justify their actions? These questions have been explored extensively in post-war scholarship, with answers that reveal complex interactions between military indoctrination, cultural values emphasizing honor and sacrifice, peer pressure within military units, and the genuine belief among many pilots that their deaths might protect Japan from invasion or improve surrender terms. Many kamikaze pilots left letters and diaries expressing their motivations, often combining resignation to inevitable defeat, desire to protect their families, loyalty to comrades, and acceptance of military duty. These documents revealed human beings struggling with fear and doubt while simultaneously preparing for certain death, a psychological complexity that defied simple characterization as either fanaticism or coercion. For American sailors who faced kamikaze attacks in 1944 and 1945, the complexity of Japanese motivations was irrelevant to the immediate horror of combat. What mattered was the existential terror of facing an enemy who had weaponized death itself, who had systematically organized and deployed human beings as guided missiles, and against whom there was no complete defense. The young sailors who watched Japanese aircraft diving toward their ships with mechanical precision, who saw their defensive fire hitting those aircraft without stopping the attacks, who witnessed their shipmates killed by attackers who died in the act of killing, experienced a form of warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about human behavior in combat. They discovered that rational actors making calculations about survival and success could be defeated by irrational actors who had eliminated survival from their calculations entirely. That revelation haunted American veterans of the Kamikaze campaign for the rest of their lives, a psychological wound from a war that transformed human beings into weapons and forced other human beings to face the question of how you fight an enemy who has already chosen death.